On the Chinese opera stage, there is a face you are meant to distrust on sight. It is painted stark white, the color of cunning, the mask of the man who smiles at you while he decides how to betray you. For 600 years, audiences have known him at a glance. He is Cao Cao, the great villain of the Three Kingdoms, the schemer who held an emperor like a puppet and trusted no living soul. And how much of that face belongs to the man who actually wore it is far from settled. The white mask was painted onto him by playwrights centuries after he died. The single most famous sentence he ever spoke, the line every Chinese schoolchild can recite, comes from a novel written more than 1100 years after his death, by an author who never met anyone who had ever met him. The villain is, in large part, a work of art. The question this episode asks is where the art stops and the record begins. The man underneath was born around the year 155, in the last violent decades of the Han Dynasty, and across a single lifetime, he would do things that seemed to belong to different men. He put a whole province to the sword, and he farmed a starving country back to life. He wrote some of the most admired poetry of his age, and he had an empress put to death. He held the throne of the empire within reach of his hand for 20 years and never took it. And he built the house his son would crown. Today he is searched for again, all over the world, through the games and the films that have made the Three Kingdoms a global story. But the Cao Cao they tell of is the painted one, the novel's villain. So this is not going to be his biography. It is going to be his trial. We are going to take the most famous villain in Chinese history, set the legend down on one side and the historical record on the other, and ask what the evidence actually says. We will not reach a verdict. By the end, you will understand why no age ever has. Begin with the charge, because the charge is what everyone already knows. The case against Cao Cao rests on its most damning line, and that line comes from its most damning scene. In the novel, the young Cao Cao, a fugitive, takes shelter for the night with an old friend of his father named Lu Buoshu. In the dark, he hears the sounds of a meal being prepared, mistakes them for the sounds of a trap being set, and kills the entire household before he understands his error. Then, riding away, he meets Lu Buoshu himself returning home, and kills him too, so that no one will live to take revenge. And when his horrified companion asks how he could do such a thing, Cao Cao gives the answer that has defined him ever since. I would rather betray the world, he says, than let the world betray me. It is one of the coldest lines in all of Chinese literature. It is also, almost certainly, not his. The line lives in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the sprawling 14th century novel by Lu Guanzhong that turned the wars of the dying Han into China's national epic. The historical record is a different thing entirely. It is the records of the Three Kingdoms, compiled in the 3rd century by a historian named Chen Shou, who lived through the era's final act, and annotated 150 years later by Pei Songjie, who gathered every conflicting account he could find and set them side by side. In that record, the Lu Buoshu incident is not one story, but 3, and they do not agree. In one, the host's family tries to rob the young Cao Cao and he kills them, defending himself. In another, he panics at a noise in the dark. In a third, he mistakes the clatter of cooking for the sound of men coming to seize him. In none of the 3 does he murder Lu Buoshu. And the famous line, in its earliest and far smaller form, is only this: better that I wrong others than they wrong me. A frightened young man's words in the aftermath of a killing in the dark. The novelist took that and inflated it into a philosophy of the whole world. This is the pattern we will follow for the next half hour, because it is the pattern of his entire reputation. Almost everything you think you know about Cao Cao the villain was sharpened or simply invented long after the man was in his grave. So who was actually on trial here? A man named Cao Cao, courtesy name Mengda, born around 155 in Cao County, in what is now Anhui Province. His family was wealthy, and it was also tainted, because his grandfather had been a palace eunuch, a class of official the Confucian elite held in deep contempt. And that shadow followed Cao Cao for the rest of his life. There is a story, recorded in later collections, that as a young man, he sought out a famous judge of character and demanded to know what he would become. And that the man told him at last, "You will be a capable minister in an age of order, and a villainous hero in an age of chaos." Cao Cao, the story says, laughed with delight. The age he was born into would be chaos. The first real charges against him are not the novelists. They are written in the record, and they are very dark. The prosecution's first piece of real evidence is a river. In the year 193, Cao Cao's father, traveling to join his son, was killed passing through Shu province to the east. The exact circumstances are murky, and even the guilt of the local governor, To Qian, is questioned in the sources. What is not questioned is the answer Cao Cao gave. He marched into Shu province and took it apart. The histories record a slaughter of ordinary people on a scale they themselves call extreme even for that violent age. They say the dead lay so thick that they dammed the Su River, that the water could not flow over the bodies. The numbers run from tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands. Those numbers must be held with care. Ancient Chinese histories reach for vast round figures the way we reach for the word countless, and the very highest counts are almost certainly rhetoric. But the core of it is not in doubt, precisely because it is recorded by historians who were broadly on his side. Cao Cao, avenging his father, massacred a civilian population that had done nothing to him. Whether out of grief, or terror used as policy, or a campaign that slipped its leash, the record sets down the act and not the mind behind it. It is the single hardest fact the defense will ever have to stand beside. It is not the last. Move forward 2 decades to the years 214 and 215. By now, Cao Cao controls the Han court completely. The emperor, a young man named Shen, reigns but does not rule. Cao Cao governs in his name and keeps him like a seal in a drawer. The empress, Fu Shou, had years earlier written a letter to her father, begging him to act against Cao Cao. This, the record says, was after Cao Cao had executed another of the emperor's consorts, together with her whole family. The letter was discovered. Cao Cao forced the emperor to depose his own wife, and his soldiers came for her. The record preserves the scene. She hid herself in a hollow inside the palace wall. She was dragged out by her hair. As they took her past the emperor, she cried out, asking whether he could not save her. And he answered, "I do not know myself how long I have to live." She was killed, and her 2 young sons by the emperor with her, and her clan after them. That is not the novel. That is the record. 2 of his own most respected officials met ends nearly as grim. Sui Yan, a man famous across the realm for his integrity, was accused of veiled criticism in a letter, imprisoned, and driven to take his own life. Chun Shou, the historian, calls it flatly an injustice. And Xun Yu, the brilliant strategist who had served Cao Cao for 20 years and whose counsel had arguably made the whole rise possible, broke with him near the end over Cao's hunger for ever greater titles and died in the year 212. How he died, the sources will not firmly say. One account, preserved in Pei Sung Jr.'s notes, has Cao Cao sent him an empty food box, a wordless message with only one meaning, and Xun Yu took poison. Chun Shou's main text says only that he died of grief and worry. The manner is disputed. The estrangement and the reason for it are not. Even the famous physician belongs partly to this column. Cao Cao suffered for years from blinding headaches and conscripted the renowned doctor Hua Tuo to treat them. Hua Tuo, homesick, claimed his wife was ill and overstayed his leave, and when the lie came out, Cao Cao had him imprisoned and put to death. The histories are clear on that, and it is ugly. What the record does not contain is the famous scene in which Hua Tuo offers to cure the headaches by splitting open Cao Cao's skull, and a suspicious Cao Cao kills him as a would-be assassin. That, like the legendary surgery on Guan Yu's arm, is the novelist's invention. What the record leaves is narrower. A renowned physician executed after he lied about his leave. This is the prosecution's case, and every piece of it is documented. A massacred province, a murdered empress, ministers driven to death over a careless word, a physician put to death for a lie. If this were everything the record held, the white mask would be honest, and we could stop here. But it is not everything the record holds. The same historians who set down the river of the dead set down something else entirely, and it does not fit the villain at all. The defense begins, strangely, in the same ruined country. The wars that tore the late Han apart did what all wars do. They emptied the fields. Armies marched, and the farmers fled or died. Where there are no farmers, there is no grain. And where there is no grain, an army eats the countryside down to the bare earth, and then starves in the middle of it. Warlord after warlord rose and then collapsed, not in battle, but at the supply line. The histories say some of their armies were reduced to eating mulberries or river mussels, and some to things far worse than that. In the year 196, the same year he took the emperor under his control, Cao Cao did something none of his rivals managed at any scale. On the advice of two officials, Cao Jr. and Han Hao, he set the broken pieces of the war to repairing themselves. Demobilized soldiers, surrendered rebels, and homeless refugees were settled onto the vast tracts of farmland the fighting had emptied. There they were put to work growing grain under military organization. The system was called Tun Ten, the agricultural garrison. The state supplied the land and the oxen, and took a heavy share of the harvest in return, often close to half of it. It was not gentle, and the tenants who worked it did not grow rich. But it worked. The record claims that the first year's harvest around the capital came to 1 million measures of grain. Whatever the true figure was, the effect is not disputed. While his rivals' armies dissolved for want of food, Cao Cao's armies ate, year after year. The same man who had dammed a river with the dead also farmed the starving north back to life, and both of those facts are written down by the same hands. He did something else that his world found close to radical. The Confucian order recruited its officials by virtue and by family name. A man's reputation for goodness and the standing of his ancestors were his qualifications for office. Cao Cao, 3 times, in formal edicts issued in the years 210, 214, and 217, threw that out. He called for talent, and for talent alone. "Bring me the able," he said, in effect. Even if they are unfilial sons, even if their reputation is bad, even if the moral examiners would never let them through the door. Find me the men who can actually do the work, and I will use them. It was a direct strike at the great aristocratic families who had held a monopoly on power for generations, and it made him bitter enemies among precisely the kind of people who would later be the ones writing him down. How fully he lived up to his own words is debated by historians. He still leaned heavily on his own clan and on the powerful families when it suited him. But the edicts are real, and the words are his, and they were a blow struck against the gatekeepers of his age. So the ledger now has 2 columns, in the same handwriting. On one side a massacre, on the other, full granaries, and a door thrown open to ability that the old order would have turned away at the gate. Neither column cancels the other, they simply both happened. And then there is a third thing in the record, the thing the villain of the stage was never supposed to be capable of, at all. The most famous villain in Chinese history was also one of its great poets. That sentence is hard to hold in a single breath, and the difficulty of holding it is the whole point of this chapter. Cao Cao stands at the head of what is called Zhen poetry, the literature of his own era, named for the reign period he dominated. Fewer than 20 of his poems survive, nearly all of them in the old folk ballad form. And they are not the perfumed court verse of a nobleman at leisure. They are spare and grave and unmistakably the work of a man who had stood in the places he was describing. In one of them, written about the collapse of the very coalition wars he himself had taken part in, he set down the price of the age in 2 lines that Chinese readers have never let go of in 18 centuries. White bones lie exposed across the wilds. For 1,000 li, there is no cry of a cock. An emptied country, the dead left unburied where they fell. Not one living creature left to make a sound across a whole province. Scholars debate whether that particular ballad is fully his, as they often do with the oldest of these folk pieces. But it sits squarely inside his body of work, and squarely inside his voice. The man who had made some of those wars also breathed them, in the plainest and hardest words anyone of his century managed to find. In the year 207, riding home from a brutal campaign in the far northeast against the Wuhan tribes, he stopped at a cliff above the sea and wrote one of the first great landscape poems in the Chinese language. He watched the autumn wind tear at the gray water, the islands standing in the surge, the sun and the moon as though they were rising and setting from inside the ocean itself. And he set himself against all that immensity, one tired old general standing at the edge of the known world. In another poem, the one called The Short Song Style, he wrote about time running out, about wine and the shortness of a life, and the ache to gather good and able men around him before the light finally failed. These are not the lines the stage villain was ever written to be able to produce. They are the lines of someone large and contradictory and fully awake to his own life, which is a far harder thing to bring into a courtroom than a monster, because a flat villain is simple to judge, and this man is not. The defense rests here on a poem about empty fields. It does not prove that he was good, it proves that he was real, and a real man resists a simple verdict, for him or against. But the prosecution still has one more exhibit, the one the entire world believes it already knows, and it is time to take it down to the river and look at it closely. There is one night in Cao Cao's life that the whole world has seen, and almost none of it happened the way the world has seen it. In the winter of the year 208, Cao Cao stood at the very height of his power. 8 years earlier, at the Battle of Guandu, he had destroyed his great northern rival Yuan Shou against long odds, and made himself master of the entire North China plain. Now he turned south to finish the work, and the campaign moved fast and met almost no resistance. From this capital at Xuchang, on the central plain, his armies marched south into Jing province, where the local warlord had just died. The heir, Liu Cong, surrendered the whole province and its river fleet at Shangyang without so much as a battle, and Cao Cao pushed on down to the great Yangtze River port of Jianling, and then swung east along the river toward the last 2 men still standing against him. The southern lord Sun Quan and the fugitive warlord Liu Bei dug in together near Shakou, where the city of Wuhan stands on the water today. Cao Cao announced that he was coming with 800,000 men. He was not. The number was propaganda, and the southerners saw straight through it. Sun Quan's young commander, a general named Zhou Yu, put Cao Cao's real strength closer to 250,000, and reminded his lord that a great many of those were the freshly surrendered troops of Jing province, men of doubtful loyalty, and that a great many of them were already falling sick. Against that, the Allies could field perhaps 50,000. It should not have been close. What actually broke Cao Cao at Red Cliffs is, in the historical record, almost mundane, and that is exactly why the novel had to replace it. His northern soldiers, strangers to the damp southern climate and to fighting on water, fell ill in enormous numbers, and an epidemic moved through the crowded camp. To steady his seasick men, he had his ships chained together, bow to stern, to hold them steady in the current. And the southern veteran Huang Gai saw the opening in that. He sent Cao Cao a forged letter offering to defect. Then he sent a squadron of ships packed with kindling and dry reeds and oil, driven down onto the chained fleet by a strong southeast wind. At the last possible moment, he set them ablaze and slipped away in small boats. The fire took hold of the linked ships, and leapt to the camp on the shore. And Cao Cao's army, already hollowed out by disease, simply broke. Now set the record beside what the novel and the films have given you. There is no Zhou Liang standing on a windswept altar, calling the southeast wind out of the sky by Taoist magic. The wind was weather, recorded as weather, the ordinary wind of that coast in that season. There are no boats stuffed with straw sent out into the fog to trick the enemy into filling them with arrows. That scene is an invention, and it is pinned on the wrong man in the wrong year. There is no fateful meeting afterward on the Huarun Road, where the loyal Guan Yu, repaying an old debt, lets a beaten Cao Cao slip through his fingers and escape. Cao Cao did retreat along that muddy road, but Guan Yu was never waiting on it. The genius of the novelist was to take a defeat caused by plague and inexperience, and rebuild it into a glittering duel of brilliant minds. There is also Cao Cao's own version of it. Years afterward he wrote that he had burned his own ships and withdrawn because of the sickness in his camp, and that Zhou Yu had been handed credit he had not earned. It is worth remembering whose account that is, a defeated commander shrinking the enemy's part in his own ruin. The record sets his version down beside Zhou Yu's, and does not tell us how to weigh the two. Red Cliffs split China into 3 rival kingdoms, and gave the whole era its name, and it is the single place where the gap between the man and the mask opens the widest. What the record blames is plague and inexperience on the water, not the contest of brilliant minds the novel stages, which leaves the last and strangest question of the entire trial. A man this powerful, who had just been checked, and who would never again be beaten on his own ground, held the Han Emperor in the palm of his hand for the rest of his life. So why did he never take the crown? The heaviest charge in the whole indictment is usurpation, the stealing of the throne. And it is the charge where the evidence cuts in 2 directions at once. By the year 216, Cao Cao had had himself made King of Wei. It was an extraordinary title to claim. Under the law of the Han, only members of the imperial Liu family were supposed to hold the rank of king, and here was a man with not a drop of royal blood taking it for himself, with the emperor entirely inside his power. Every lever was in his hand. He held the armies, the capital, the treasury, the court, and the young emperor who did precisely what he was told and nothing he was not. The throne of all China was a single step away, and Cao Cao had spent his whole life taking steps exactly like that one. He never took this one. For all the years that were left to him, Cao Cao remained king of Wei, and the powerless Emperor Xian remained, in name, the emperor. When his own followers pressed him to climb the final step and take the throne, the record preserves his reply, or at least a reply attributed to him in the commentaries. "If the mandate of heaven is truly meant for me," he is said to have answered, "then let me be King Wan of Zhou." It is a careful and a loaded comparison, and every educated man listening would have caught it at once. King Wan was the ancient sage who held most of the realm and most of the people's loyalty, but who never overthrew the failing dynasty above him, and who left the final act, the taking of the crown, to his son. Cao Cao was saying, in the oldest language of Chinese history, that he would build the house and let his heir be the one to put the roof on it. That is exactly what came to pass. Cao Cao died in the spring of the year 220, around 65 years old, still formally a subject, still nominally a servant of the Han he had hollowed out. Within the same year, his son, Cao Pi, did the thing the father had not. He forced Emperor Xian to abdicate, founded the Wei dynasty in his own name, and made himself emperor. Then he gave his dead father the title the living man had never once claimed for himself, Emperor Wu of Wei, an emperor only in the past tense, crowned by his son after he was already in the ground. The prosecution has an answer to all of this, and it is a sharp one. A man who makes himself king of Wei against the law of the Han, who strips the emperor of every power but his name, and who tells his own followers that he will be a king one of Zhou, has not declined to take the throne. He has only scheduled it and left his son to sign it. Restraint in title is not the same as restraint in substance, and the dynasty that carried his name was standing, fully built, the day he died. Why he held back even in name is the great unanswered question of his life, and the record gives us his actions, but never his mind. Perhaps it was cold calculation, the knowledge that the name of the Han still carried a weight an open usurper would throw away the instant he reached for the crown. Perhaps it was a genuine line that he of all people would not step over. Perhaps the difference between ruling everything and being called the ruler of everything simply did not interest a man who already, unquestionably, had the first. Or perhaps he preferred to let his son carry the risk and the odium of the final step. The trial cannot read his heart, and it should not pretend that it can. It can only record the facts, and the facts pull both ways. The great usurper of the Chinese imagination held the empire in his hand for 20 years, with the throne a single step away, and never took that step. Whether that makes him less of a usurper or only a more patient one, the record hands to us. So, how did this man become that mask? The answer is the most revealing evidence in the entire case. Because the verdict on Cao Cao did not hold steady. It was rewritten over and over across the centuries. And every single time it was rewritten, it tells you far more about the age doing the rewriting than it does about the man being judged. In the beginning, the verdict was admiring. Chun Shou, the 3rd century historian, whose record we have leaned on through this whole trial, called Cao Cao an extraordinary man, a hero beyond the measure of his age, and gave his achievements their full due. Centuries after that, the great Song historian Sima Guang, compiling his vast chronicle of the past, still treated Cao Cao's way as the legitimate succession to the fallen Han. For something close to 1,000 years, the educated verdict on Cao Cao was that he had been a brilliant and ruthless founder, the kind of figure that history is usually willing, in the end, to forgive. Then the ground moved under him. In the southern Song dynasty, with the Song themselves driven south by northern invaders and clinging hard to their own legitimacy, the philosopher Zhu Xi and the Neo-Confucian school redrew the entire moral map of the 3 kingdoms. Now, in their reading, the rightful heir to the Han was no longer Cao Cao's powerful way in the north. It was Liu Bei's weak and doomed kingdom of Shu in the west, the underdog who claimed the old imperial bloodline and the old virtue. Sympathy swung hard toward Liu Bei and his sworn brothers, and Cao Cao, simply by standing on the other side of that line, hardened into the villain of the piece. The theater then finished the job. In the operas of the Yuan and the Ming, Cao Cao was given the white-painted face, the stage mask of the brilliant and treacherous schemer, and one Chinese word fixed itself to him and never came loose: Jiansheng, the villain hero, the man whose very gifts only make him more dangerous to everyone around him. And then, in the 14th century, Luo Guanzhong's novel gathered all of it together: the legitimacy of Shu, the villainy of Cao, the white face, the invented lines, a murdered friend. It bound them into the single most widely read story in the Chinese world, and sealed the verdict for everyone who came after. But even that was not the end of the rewriting, because the rewriting never actually stops. In the 20th century, the verdict swung back again. In the late 1950s, in the New People's Republic, Cao Cao was reappraised in a way that suited the new state's image of itself. Figures including Mao Zedong spoke approvingly of him, and the scholar Guo Mu Rou argued in print and on the stage to overturn the old verdict, pointing in his telling to the land reforms and the consolidation of the North, and arguing that the man's merits should be weighed above his faults. Like every verdict before it, this was an age painting its own preferred face onto him, reading its own past for the kind of ruler it wished to find there, exactly as the Song moralists and the Ming playwrights had painted theirs. Some of what the reappraisal pointed to had been sitting in the 3rd century record all along. Whether that made it a recovery of the truth, or simply one more coat of paint, is, like everything else in this trial, contested. Every age, it turns out, gets the Cao Cao that it needs. Which leaves us, here at the end of the trial, with a man buried under a deep stack of verdicts. Each one painted directly over the last, and not one of them quite him. We can scrape the layers away, one at a time. We are far less able to say, with any confidence, what is left on the panel underneath. So, we come back, at the last, to the 2 columns of the ledger. And we leave them open, because an open ledger is the only honest place to leave this. On the one side, a province put to the sword for the crime of standing in his father's road. An empress dragged by her hair from a hole in a wall and killed with her 2 young sons. Loyal ministers driven to their deaths over a single careless line. A physician put to death for wanting to go home to his wife. On the other side, a ruined and starving country farmed slowly back to life. A door thrown open to ability that the proud old order had always despised. Some of the truest and hardest poetry his language has ever produced. And a crown within reach of his hand for 20 years that he looked at and weighed and left lying on the table. Both columns are written in the same 3rd century hand, by historians who had no reason to invent either one. Neither column erases the other. The man was not the white mask of the opera stage, and he was not the misunderstood reformer that the next age would so badly want him to be. He was large enough to hold all of it at once: the Granaries and the river of the dead, the poem and the murdered empress. And that capacity is the one thing every neat and simple verdict has been built to look away from. This trial reaches no verdict. That was the promise made at the very start, and it is kept now, on purpose. Because the real lesson of Cao Cao is not which of the 2 columns finally wins. It is that the face we were all handed, the white mask, the cold and famous line, the smiling schemer of the story, tells us almost nothing about the man, and almost everything about the long parade of people who kept on repainting him to suit themselves. 600 years of theater, 1,000 years of shifting politics, one immortal novel. Set every layer of it aside, scrape the panel down to the wood, and what is actually left in the record is not a monster, and it is not a hero. It is a human being, contradictory and unfinished, and far too large for the frame, still waiting after 1,800 years on a verdict that was perhaps never ours to give.